What if an entire city could be silenced in a single summer? Tonight, we step into New Orleans in 1853, when yellow fever changed thousands of lives forever. Welcome to Richard's History. I'm Richard, and I'm honored to have you here. If you appreciate meaningful historical journeys, please subscribe and share this video. Some images are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. I hope this episode brings you reflection and a quiet sense of connection. In 1853, New Orleans stood as one of the most important commercial cities in the American South. Ships crowded the Mississippi River, carrying cotton, sugar, and goods from across the Atlantic world. The port drew thousands of immigrants each year, especially from Ireland and Germany, men and women who believed this humid Gulf city offered opportunity and a fresh beginning. Streets echoed with many languages, markets were busy, trade was strong. On the surface, it was a season of confidence and growth, but the summer of 1853 brought unusual conditions. Early months were intensely hot and dry, baking the city under a relentless southern sun. Then, July arrived with steady, soaking rains. Water collected in cisterns, gutters, barrels, and low streets. Stagnant pools lingered in courtyards and along the riverfront. Residents complained about swarms of mosquitoes thicker than they could remember. At the time, these insects were seen as little more than an irritation, a familiar nuisance of life in Louisiana. No one yet understood their role in transmitting disease. For 6 consecutive years, New Orleans had avoided a major yellow fever outbreak. That recent history fostered a sense of reassurance. Many believed the worst epidemics belonged to the past. This confidence, shaped by memory and economic optimism, would soon prove dangerously misplaced. On the 28th of May, 1853, physicians at Charity Hospital recorded what would later be recognized as the first suspected case of yellow fever that season. At first, it did not appear extraordinary. New Orleans was a port city, accustomed to illness arriving by ship. Fevers were common in the warm months, and doctors had limited tools to distinguish one from another. Yet within days, more patients began to show similar symptoms. By June 10, the diagnosis was clear. Yellow fever had returned. For many residents, this confirmation came quietly, almost cautiously. City newspapers did not immediately sound the alarm. Editors understood that New Orleans depended on trade and shipping. Public panic could disrupt commerce, drive away vessels, and damage the economy. Reports were softened or delayed. The growing number of cases did not dominate headlines in the way we might expect today. Meanwhile, daily life continued amid troubling conditions. Waste often accumulated in the streets. Animal carcasses could remain in gutters for days. Drainage was poor, and stagnant water lingered in crowded neighborhoods. In an era before modern sanitation systems, these realities were familiar but dangerous. Few understood how closely the city's environment was intertwined with what was about to unfold. By late July, the situation could no longer be minimized or quietly managed. For the week ending July 23, more than 400 people were reported dead from yellow fever. In a city of roughly 100,000 residents, that number was staggering. Church bells rang with unsettling frequency. Obituaries filled entire columns. What had begun as a troubling outbreak was now a public catastrophe. Panic followed swiftly. Those with financial means packed their belongings and left for the countryside or for northern cities, hoping distance would offer protection. Steamboats carried families away from the docks that only weeks earlier symbolized opportunity, but many could not leave. Poor laborers, dock workers, domestic servants, and newly arrived immigrants had neither the funds nor the connections to escape. They remained in crowded neighborhoods where exposure was constant and fear unavoidable. The disease itself was relentless. It often began suddenly, with high fever, intense muscle pain, headaches, and chills that left patients trembling despite the oppressive heat. Some initially appeared to improve after a brief remission, offering false hope to families gathered at the bedside. Then the more severe phase could set in. The virus attacked the liver, leading to jaundice that turned the skin and eyes a distinct yellow, the origin of the name yellow fever. One of the most terrifying symptoms was known as black vomit. This dark fluid, caused by internal bleeding in the stomach, signaled severe organ failure. Witnesses described it with dread, understanding that it frequently marked the final stage. In many cases, death followed within a week of the first symptoms. For countless families in New Orleans that summer, the timeline from health to burial was measured not in months, but in days. As August approached, the scale of death overwhelmed New Orleans in ways few American cities had ever experienced. The number of daily fatalities surpassed the capacity of families, churches, and burial societies to respond with dignity and order. Funeral processions became constant. Coffins were in short supply. Carpenters worked without pause, yet demand outpaced production. In some neighborhoods, bodies remained inside homes for longer than anyone would have considered acceptable in ordinary times. In the most desperate circumstances, reports described the deceased lying in the streets, awaiting collection. Under the intense summer heat, decomposition advanced quickly. The emotional strain on surviving relatives was compounded by the physical reality of decay in a city already struggling with sanitation. Cemeteries, including the well-known above-ground burial grounds that define New Orleans even today, could not absorb the sudden surge. Gravediggers labored from dawn until nightfall. When individual graves could no longer be prepared fast enough, coffins were placed together in shallow trenches. Heavy rains, which continued intermittently, sometimes disturbed freshly covered soil. Contemporary accounts speak of scenes that residents later struggled to describe without anguish. Facing this crisis, city authorities offered unusually high wages to recruit laborers willing to handle the dead. $5 per hour was an extraordinary rate for the time, reflecting both urgency and the danger associated with the task. In a summer defined by fear, even burial work became a frontline response. New Orleans was not only battling disease, it was fighting to preserve basic human dignity amid relentless loss. As fear deepened, city leaders acted according to the medical understanding of their time. Most physicians and officials accepted the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through foul-smelling air rising from decay and filth. In a city already struggling with waste and stagnant water, this explanation felt logical. If bad air caused illness, then the solution was to cleanse the atmosphere. Mayor John T. Monroe authorized the firing of cannons at sunrise and sunset. The thunder of artillery echoed across the riverfront and through residential wards. Many believed the shockwaves would disperse poisonous vapors and restore healthy air. At the same time, barrels of tar were placed at street corners and set alight. Thick black smoke rolled through neighborhoods, darkening the skyline and filling lungs with acrid fumes. Contemporary observers described the city as appearing almost engulfed in a smoky haze. These efforts reflected urgency rather than ignorance. Officials were working with the best theories available to them. Yet, we now know that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes, particularly Aedes aegypti, a fact not scientifically confirmed until decades later. While cannons roared and tar burned, mosquitoes continued breeding in cisterns, puddles, and water containers throughout the city. The true source of transmission remained untouched, quietly sustaining the epidemic. Inside hospitals, boarding houses, and private homes, physicians confronted a crisis they did not fully understand. A central debate divided the medical community. Some argued that yellow fever was imported by ships arriving from the Caribbean or Central America. Others insisted it originated locally, generated by the city's climate and unsanitary conditions. Without knowledge of viral transmission or mosquitoes as vectors, both sides were working within the limits of 19th century science. There was no proven cure. Treatment focused on relieving symptoms and attempting to control what doctors believed were dangerous imbalances in the body. Quinine was administered in large quantities, sometimes in doses that produced toxic side effects. Calomel, a mercury-based compound commonly used at the time, was prescribed to purge the system, despite its known risks. Turpentine and other harsh substances were also given in hopes of counteracting internal damage. Bloodletting, though declining in popularity by the 1850s, was still practiced by some practitioners. In many cases, these interventions weakened patients already fighting severe infection. Mortality remained high, and physicians often had to watch helplessly as conditions deteriorated. Amid this uncertainty, acts of compassion stood out. The Howard Association, a volunteer organization of young businessmen, raised funds, distributed medicine, and arranged care for the sick, especially among immigrants and the poor. The Sisters of Charity at Charity Hospital continued tending to patients regardless of risk. Their work did not stop the epidemic, but it offered dignity and relief in a season defined by suffering. The epidemic also revealed stark social and racial divisions within New Orleans. Official records from 1853 show a striking disparity in mortality. Approximately 7.4% of the white population died during the outbreak, while the recorded death rate among the black population was about 0.2%. Historians generally attribute this difference to acquired immunity. Many enslaved, or formerly enslaved black residents, had ancestral roots in regions where yellow fever was endemic, and prior exposure may have provided partial resistance. At the time, however, this reality was interpreted through the lens of slavery and racial ideology. Pro-slavery advocates pointed to the lower mortality rate among black residents as supposed evidence that they were naturally suited to labor in the southern climate. Such arguments ignored the brutality of the institution itself and distorted medical observation into political justification. The majority of victims were recent immigrants, particularly young adults between 15 and 40 years old. Many had arrived from Ireland and Germany, seeking stability after famine and political upheaval in Europe. They lacked immunity to the disease and often lived in densely populated districts where exposure was constant. For these newcomers, the promise of opportunity in America was replaced by sudden loss. The epidemic did not strike evenly. It exposed vulnerability shaped by origin, status, and circumstance. In October 1853, a change finally arrived that no cannon fire or burning tar had achieved. The first frost of the season swept through New Orleans. With the drop in temperature, mosquito activity sharply declined. Though residents did not yet understand the scientific connection, the number of new yellow fever cases began to fall. For the first time in months, the city sensed that the worst might be passing. When official records were compiled, 8,096 deaths were attributed to the epidemic. In practical terms, that meant roughly 1 out of every 12.5 residents had died within a single season. Few families were untouched. Churches, businesses, and entire neighborhoods carried visible scars of absence. The demographic and economic impact lingered long after the fever itself subsided. The tragedy forced structural change. In 1855, Louisiana established a state board of health, one of the earliest statewide public health bodies in the United States. Its creation reflected a growing recognition that epidemics required organized oversight, data collection, and coordinated response rather than ad hoc measures. For New Orleans, the epidemic of 1853 became one of the darkest chapters in its history. It reshaped public health policy and left a memory that endured for generations. Today, when we look back, we see not only statistics, but a community tested by fear, loss, and resilience in the face of a disease it did not yet understand. For me, the summer of 1853 will always feel like a season of black smoke and black vomit, a time when a thriving city seemed to descend into something close to hell. New Orleans was not defeated by war, but by a disease its people did not yet understand. They fought with courage, faith, and desperation against an invisible enemy. Tonight, we remember more than 8,000 souls who were lost. The images in this video are created with artificial intelligence to help visualize the story, and they may not perfectly match every detail. I invite you to share your thoughts below, subscribe to Robert's History, and like and share this episode if it moved you.